Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Fun House. It's bright and early here today, and I welcome once again, as I do every week, Mr. Martin Popoff.
Yes, morning, sir.
How are
How's
you?
it
How are
going?
things in Canada today, Martin?
Pretty good. It's raining now, but I had a nice sort of adventure yesterday. I went for a jog in the Don Valley. So I went for a jog. I was out for the length of two lengths of a Cure of a The Cult album with 10 tracks on it. So I know I was out for about an hour 20, totally wiped out. And then I'm fooling around with my fob and my keys and my bag at the trunk. And I closed the back of the trunk and I locked my fob in because I take the fob off and keep it in my pocket, right? So I had to walk out of the valley, walk down to the bus station, bus back to the office where I have my other fob, walk half, bus back. An hour something turned into a 3 hour. But it was nice yesterday. It was nice and warm, and it was great. But yeah, today it's totally overcast. But yeah, got a little more exercise than I planned on yesterday.
Well, I mean, that's always a good thing at our
Yeah,
age. Any exercise is a good thing.
yeah, yeah.
It's been such a weird week for me. I have not hit the gym at all this week, and I'm really upset with myself
Yeah.
because we had the bad weather for a day and a half, right? There was that. I've had tons of meetings for the day job. So like I literally have hardly left this house all week, and I'm dying to get out of here and go, you know, walk or run the track and get on some weights or do something. I'm ready to like bash something right now. I'm like, because it's like when you get into a routine and then you can't do the things you want to do. I mean, yesterday, a perfect example, like because I've gone a couple days without working out, like yesterday at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I felt like I wanted to take a nap. I was exhausted because you're used to getting that adrenaline going like right around the same time every day. Like
Yeah.
you usually go at
Good point.
lunchtime. And I'm like,
Yeah.
why am I so tired? I'm like, I slept like 7.5 hours last night. I'm like, it's because I haven't worked out all week and my body's
Yeah.
just telling me it's like, hey, you need to
Yeah.
get that adrenaline pumping. So today I'm going there no matter what. I'm looking at my schedule. I'm like, it's tight, but I'm gonna go. Even if it's for a half hour, I'm gonna go.
Nice.
So anyway, but yeah, cloudy here too, overcast. I don't know. I think it's supposed to be 55 here today. So we had all that snow the other day, and yesterday was 50. Today it's gonna be in the 50s. So it's all melting. There's mud and slush everywhere. It's a mess. It's a mess. So I'm ready for the nicer weather. I've had enough of this.
Yeah.
So we've got a really interesting show for you guys here today. So Martin and I have been talking and trying to fine tune this topic, and this is really based on comments and feedback that we get from you guys when we talk about albums and we talk about catalogs and we talk about albums that like back when they got released, whether it's 50 years ago, 40, 30, 20, that critics and fans were kind of dumping on as really not really strong albums, not in line with the band's classic albums. But what we've been noticing in recent years is when we now talk about some of those albums today, a lot of you guys watching and reading and listening seem to be saying, well, but that's such a classic album. And so the question we have for everybody, and we have lots of examples we're going to go through today, is are these albums that were maybe deemed not so good back in the day, are they now, are you guys considering them great because you're bored with the classics? After all these years, are you bored with those legendary albums and you're going to those lesser albums and saying, well, these are just as good, if not better? Or were these albums always classic in your mind and in your eyes and in your hearts? That's kind of what we want to get to today. So we've each picked 5 bands that have some examples of this. And we're going to talk about these albums and maybe talk a little bit about why back in the day they were considered maybe lesser releases, and kind of maybe think about and talk about some reasons why people might think all these years later they're actually really, really good. Martin, if you want to expand on that a little bit before we get started.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the reasons that sort of sprung to mind as well is we've been doing on the Contrarians, we've been doing these dark horse panels where you get like 5 or 6 guys together and it goes like an hour and you're talking about one of these dark horse albums, whether it's Who Do We Think We Are, Thin Lizzy, Chinatown. But one of the ones that happened, actually, this was Marco putting up an older archival show, which was just him and Brett, I think it was, talking about Kiss the Elder, right? So I shared this on Facebook, and you get people typing in. It's like, oh, The Elder's a classic. It's my favorite Kiss album. It's like wildly underrated and stuff. And it just the thought popped into my mind is that, oh, it's funny you hear this. It's because people are bored, and so the idea is, well, let's start with that one as an
Yeah, I mean,
example.
because The Elder is the reason why we're doing this show. That was sparked the whole conversation. We got to thank Monty
Yes.
Connor too for jumping in and adding some spark to that discussion on Facebook, because that's kind of the genesis of this whole idea.
Exactly. So rather than kind of go through all the different reasons, and you've mentioned a couple as well, let's start with Kiss as an example, because the Kiss example, I think, aligns with that word bored more than anything. Kiss is so intensely discussed, and yet the music is pretty simple, and there's not much to the lyrics and all that. There's not much to the productions, and they've got this catalog. So we got into this debate about the idea that there's not enough Kiss to go around. So you eventually start talking seriously, more seriously than you maybe should, about some of these albums, about every album eventually. And then, Pete, when you and I talked, we talked about how there's a big fat book on just the Kiss solo albums and stuff like that, right? Intense analysis of these albums, right? So yeah, Kiss is my first example. And here's another one, Unmasked. I mean, I know a lot of people who are, basically Unmasked was supposed to be just a crappy album, and it was for years and years and years and years. Now it's transformed in, because nobody's talked enough about Unmasked, because they're sick of talking about Destroyer and Hotter Than Hell and all these other big Kiss albums, Rock and Roll Over. Now, suddenly the narrative is, it's a really good pop album, but it's not a Kiss album, but it's a really good. Well, can it be a bad pop album? It's
sure.
I think it can still be a bad pop album. It doesn't
Right.
have
We'll
to
be
be
saying
good.
that back. We were saying that back in the day. We're like, this is a shitty Kiss album. It's not even a good pop album. I remember
Exactly.
it,
Yeah.
but now all of a sudden, whoa, it's
serious analysis of Shandy and all these songs, right?
Yeah.
Sure Knows Something, or I don't even know if they're on that. We're Destroyer. I get them mixed up. But another one that I feel like with Kiss is happening. So Elder is another perfect example. People are like debating, it's much better than, because it's one they actually did put some thought into, right?
Yeah.
It's an album that is a concept album, and it's a little more complicated and stuff. So it feels like there's more meat on the bones to talk about. But believe me, people are talking about it, and they have, right? Yeah. I think we have the Marco and Brett episode, and I think we even have a whole Dark Horse panel episode on that. But another one is the Paul Stanley solo album, right? So we haven't quite gotten around to people, reviving the reputation of the Gene Simmons or Peter Criss album. We know the narrative on the Ace album has always been, oh, it's the best one, right? But even that one back in the day, it wasn't considered a masterpiece, right? Now it's a masterpiece.
But it was the strongest out of a bunch of questions.
But now it's a masterpiece, right? It's, among all albums, it's just a great album, period. But this is the one now, because people have run out of things to talk about with Kiss. They're going back and saying, no, that Paul album is actually maybe a masterpiece too, kind of thing. So yeah, that's my first example, and I think first category. This is definitely one of the bands in my list of 5 that fits that. There's not enough Kiss to go around. We're bored about talking about the other Kiss albums. We have to talk about these albums, and just by virtue of talking about them, we're treating them maybe more seriously than they deserve.
Yeah, I mean, The Elder, I'm amazed at how much discussion is happening over the last couple of years of The Elder. Hey, now all of a sudden it's this great concept album. It's their big prog album, and it's like, so now we shit on it back then, but now it's interesting. I mean, Stephen Reed was showing me this like 1,000-page book that someone wrote on The Elder, analyzing The Elder, and Stephen, I love you, but man, the fact that you read that and bought it, and it's, I mean, I will tell you, Martin, back in the day, I thought The Elder was a pile of rubbish. I can listen to it today, and I don't hate it anymore. There's some good stuff on there. I don't think it works overall, but man, you see comments all the time. Now, all of a sudden, The Elder is like this spectacular thing that Kiss created, and okay. I don't know. We really must be bored with Destroyer and Love Gun at this point, if that's what we're talking about. So anyway, all right. So I'm going to move on to Judas Priest here.
Okay.
So again, we have talked about for years and years and years the virtues of Stained Class and Hellbent for Leather, Killing Machine, and Screaming for Vengeance, and Sin After Sin, and so on and so forth, right? But you see a lot of people now talking about albums like Point of Entry, which at the time, most of us were saying, wow, that's kind of light. That's really, really melodic, kind of poppy. It's not that all that heavy. Songs are okay, but yeah, this was deemed a mediocre Priest album back when this was released. Now, this is prime Priest, right? Same thing for an album that I think they took a lot of shit for, which is Turbo. I mean, the backlash against Turbo was ridiculous back in the day. Not only the look, they changed their look, teased the hair. They're jumping on the hair metal bandwagon. There's guitar synthesizers on this album. There, the Turbo Lover song, which we thought was ridiculous nowadays. Man, you go to see Judas Priest now in concert, man, they play Turbo Lover, place goes bananas. Everybody's like, now all of a sudden, Turbo Lover is cool, right? When back then, not cool at all. So that's crazy. The craziest one of all, I don't know one person. I don't know one person when this album came out thought this was any good. And myself and Chris Allo have been making a career in the last bunch of years on shitting all over Nostradamus. Yet every time we do so, someone comes out of the woodwork, and usually it's way more than one, saying that this is a bona fide concept album classic. I wish Priest would have done more stuff like this. I don't understand why everybody hates this album. Meanwhile, back in the day, no one bought it. No one cared about it. No one talked about it. But now everybody is all singing the praises of Nostradamus. Where were you when this album came out? The band practically disowns this album. They were going to go out and play it all on tour. They decided not to do that. There's a reason for it. But now this is a classic. Why is it a classic? I don't know. Now it's like when I say it's junk, people get all upset about it. So I guess, why is that? What is so great? Why are we that bored with all those other albums that we mentioned? Are we that bored with Painkiller? Are we that bored with even the newer ones that this one gets talked about more than a really cool album like Firepower? I don't know. That's the answers we're looking for today.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because you think of that, and we just railed on about the Elder, and what do they have in common? They're a concept album, so it gives you more to talk about, right? There's a story there. You can expound on it. You can expand on it. Someone will one day write the sequel to Nostradamus as a book, right? Someone probably has written the sequel to the Elder as a book, right? Yeah. And that the weird stuff that I'm doing with the Imagino story, right? So there's the concept album part of it. But also another thing I've noticed is that so when you extrapolate past that, you say somebody put a lot of work into this. They put a lot of work into the lyrics, the story, or whatever. Notice how some of the most expensive, rare old records are prog albums, right? So again, it's the idea of some band put a lot of work into this. So we're going to go back with rose-colored glasses and say, wow, well, it's actually pretty good, because subconsciously we're thinking a lot of hours were put into this. They're great musicians, blah, blah, blah. The production's amazing. There's arrangements. So you notice that certain kinds of music have a large propensity of being those $600,000, $800,000 old records, right? Yeah. And prog is like that. So that might be a commonality there too.
Yeah. And another thing I just thought about too is that, and specifically Nostradamus and the Elder, a lot of the classic albums, everybody has like their favorite songs from them, right? They're classic for a reason, because maybe the albums flow really well. Maybe they have 4 or 5 just total banger tracks that, maybe got radio play and whatnot. I mean, could you name off the top of your head like one song off of Nostradamus that you can like say something about, or even the Elder? Yeah. I can't. Yeah. It's like there's nothing to me. There's nothing that stands out as like, okay, this is top shelf Judas Priest or Kiss. I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah.
But any of the other albums, you're like, oh, for sure, that's got this, that, and the other thing. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I'll agree with you quickly on both Point of Entry and Turbo. You know, the thing people that you can't sort of attack is when people say, "Oh, their songwriting really improved," right? So songwriting, you know, all of us, no one knows what good songwriting is particularly, right? But when these bands do this, when Judas Priest does this, and you want to, you know, you want to defend Point of Entry over British Steel, you'll say, "Oh, but look how sophisticated they've become with their songwriting. Look at the hooks. You know, the hooks are much more sophisticated, sort of thing." So you see that.
Oh,
And the
that's
last one I'll mention with Priest is Painkiller. Just seems to be one of these that you know, when it came out of at the time, it was liked and it was loved, and it was considered a bit of a return. But that one just keeps creeping up all the time over time, to the point where you see it top a lot of polls for great Priest albums. And I think what you're seeing there is this passing on of the baton through the generations, where the, you know, the younger people are going to be more vocal, and they're going to talk about those later albums more, and all of a sudden you get that little you know, baby boom blip, you know, but it's a later boom blip. It's Gen X or Gen Z blip,
yeah.
where
I
those
also
albums
think
are the important ones.
Painkiller 2, people have fond memories of because it helped ease the pain of having to deal with Turbo and Ram It Down. And that was their comeback album. And I think a lot of hardcore Priest fans will always look fondly at that album, and maybe even more so over time, because it got Priest out of the doldrums back into being a real metal band once again. And I think my perception is that people overrate that album a little bit because of that. I'm not saying it's not a really good album, because it is, but I think it's because that kind of rescued Priest from the dumps for a little bit. And then, of course, you know, Rob left the band, so it was kind of a moot point anyway. But yeah.
Cool. All right. So my next choice is Yes. So we've got the Drama album, and I feel like this is a record that you know, was not accepted at the time. John Anderson isn't there, but I just see more and more and more all the time people loving that album. People forget the memory of the, you know, the drastic lineup change. You know, it is just on the face of it exactly what you want from a Yes album anyways, except for not having the John Anderson bit. But this one I've seen just rise in estimation, you know, over time. And again, you know, it is literally of another generation, because Yes had, you know, a solid 10 years of albums before Drama, and drama. Yeah, I get heck for that as well. But here's another one from Yes that I've noticed that there's been quite a rejuvenation of the reputation on. I see a lot of people talking about Big Generator and taking it seriously, and we might have even done a Contrarians Dark Horse panel on that, where again you get a whole bunch of guys talking seriously about this record for an hour, and just the act of talking seriously about it fits that. And then you know, I think Tales from Topographic Oceans has a little bit of that going on as well, where I've just noticed recently, you know, people have dampened back the ridicule of it, and the ridiculousness of the story, and the whole Hare Krishna religious culty sort of feel of the whole thing, and you know, have been taking it seriously and treating it as a classic. And again, I think I didn't go on this panel, but we might have done a panel on that one as well. So
I think,
you know,
Topographic Oceans kind of goes both ways, right? I mean, there's plenty of people who
yep.
now think it's a classic, when back then, you know, it got a little ridiculed back in the day. But I also think that there are people who loved it back then, and now they're realizing how ridiculous and overblown it is, right? That's kind of me, I think. But I hear all the time people are like, oh, Topographic Ocean is one of their top 2 or 3 albums. I'm kind of like, really? Maybe. I don't know.
It's funny. We when, you know, just as background, when Pete and I were working on these lists, like we were like disagreeing on some of these things. So it makes it us feel like the concept is a little unsure at times, right? And then it depends who you're talking about, and the Facebook comments, the YouTube comments as well. So yeah, that's my Yes one. I can't really think of too many more for Yes, which brings up one other point. There were a lot of bands I looked at where I couldn't find any like this, right? So it's funny how this doesn't apply for all bands. Not every band has one of these, but those are my Yes ones.
Yeah, and I think sometimes this pertains to a band with not an enormous catalog, right? I think a lot of the bands that we're probably touching on today, they don't have 25 albums, right? That they have like a manageable number of records. So the really, really big ones, there's not a lot of them. There's not a lot more after that. So we've kind of, everybody's been so busy listening and enjoying and loving those classics for 30, 40, 50 years. And now we're kind of like, all right, I never need to hear Close to the Edge ever again. So where else can I go in the Yes catalog to something that's maybe not so ingrained in my psyche? Oh, yeah, drama. You know what? That's actually pretty good. That's actually really good. Why didn't I listen to that all those years ago? Why did I shit on that back then? It's actually really good. Why is it so good? I don't know. Just because I don't want to listen to the other ones anymore.
Yeah, and it brings up a good point that what you're often going to see with these albums that are getting reassessed is they're quite old, right? So people love them. They got that cachet of being either by the classic lineup or a classic lineup adjacent or close to around that time. But they're released in that oeuvre, that magical period for these bands. It's just that they were never so it takes a long time for these records to get that extra look in.
Right. And these are old records, but now all of a sudden they're kind of new to the people who are now reassessing them, right? Because they didn't give them the time of day back 40 plus years ago. All right. Next up, King Crimson. So the two albums in question to me that I think were always looked at kind of weirdly in their catalog because it sits between two very distinct eras, the first lineup of the band, and then however you look at it, the third or the fourth lineup of the band, because Fripp was changing members like left and right and kind of in between. And these were albums, these didn't particularly sell all that well. They've been reviewed kind of lacklusterly over the years. And quite frankly, most King Crimson fans never really talk about these two records because they're too busy talking about Court of the Crimson King and maybe Wake Up Poseidon, and then the Bruford and Wetton era of the band, which of course is Lark's Tongues and Aspic, Starless and Bible Black and Red. So Lizard is the first one. You know, kind of a weird album, right? It's kind of jazzy, kind of almost chamber folky. It's not a heavy album. It's not an overly symphonic album. It's prog, but it's kind of weird prog. Lots of weird, the big cast of characters on here. John Anderson sings on a track, right? Gave him a little notoriety there. But, you know, it's an album that doesn't necessarily flow really well, but it's interesting. Interesting doesn't generally equate to classic, right? But now, because I think everybody who's a Crimson fan has probably heard those other albums I mentioned before so much, all of a sudden it's like, let's give some more time to this. Let's jump back into this one. And you know what? It really isn't that bad. Is it a classic? I don't know, but people all the time. Same thing with Islands. All right. And I'll be perfectly honest. I was kind of in this, exactly what we're talking about today. I'm guilty of with these two albums. I kind of ignored these way back when. And now when I listen to these albums, I'm like, oh, shit, you know, Formentera Lady and Sailor Song and Islands. I mean, these are great songs. Maybe this album is way better than I ever thought it was. And going to see King Crimson on tour a couple times in more recent years, they're playing lots of stuff from these albums. And now it's just like, wow, this is really good material. Like, so does it take, and that's another thing that we really haven't touched on. Does it take one of these legendary bands to go and resurface and play some of these old songs from these maybe albums that aren't looked at so greatly live in concert many, many years later? Can that bring out a spark in the fan to go back and look at these albums in a different light? Because it's almost like for me, I'm discovering some of this stuff for the first time, not because I listened to these plenty back then, but my opinion has changed over the years. And now all of a sudden I see these in a different light. It's like, well, you know what? I've heard 21st Century Schizoid Man and Red and all that kind of stuff so much. This to me sounds fresh now. Does that mean it's on par with those other albums? Maybe not. But in my mind, I'm pushing this higher up the ranks because it's almost like a new discovery. This is almost like these albums are kind of new to me now, even though I've been listening to them for 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll agree with those. And a funny thing with King Crimson, I almost feel like thrack has become the discipline of the latter day trio.
I almost picked that too. Yeah, I agree.
You've got thrack and Construction of Light and Power to Believe. And it brings up the point that maybe because the second and third of a quote unquote trilogy, you only know it's a trilogy because there was a bunch of time before Thrak, and there's a bunch of time where there's been no new King Crimson albums. So you start looking at it as a trilogy because of the passage of time.
Yeah.
And then maybe you're frustrated with the second and the third of the trilogy, and all of a sudden that casts a better light on the first of the trilogy. So Thrak to me is starting to, like, start going up, and those other ones are staying kind of low. And it's a little bit of that adjustment you see going on, or the narrative where Discipline's considered the best of the trio of the red, blue, and yellow, right?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people are looking at Thrak more so now than back when Thrak first came out, as that kind of like marriage, or like the child of the marriage of Red and Discipline, right? Because really, when you listen to Thrak, it takes a lot of elements from the kind of noisiness and the savagery of Red, with that intricate kind of new thing that Crimson were doing with Discipline, and it kind of takes all that, mixes it up, and spits it out to something kind of different but kind of not. And I think, Thrak, when it first came out, was kind of jarring. It's like, holy cow, most of us enjoyed it, but we enjoyed it from afar almost. And now, all these years later, after Thrak came out, it's like, you look back at Thrak, it's like, yeah, that's could be one of their better albums. We weren't saying that when it first came out, but now possibly, because maybe now we're making those connections, right? Like we just said.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So my next choice is Rush. So you think of, I'm seeing Caress of Steel getting a lot more love now. So the idea here, of course, is this is Down the Tubes tour. It didn't do as well as Fly By Night. People consider it dark. The recording's a little thin on it. But, every time you do a show on Rush of any sort, and we might have done a panel on this. I can't remember, but, people will come out of the woodwork and say, I can picture the Facebook comments right off the top of my head. Oh, Caress of Steel is my favorite Rush album of all time. Right. So you're starting to see that. And again, this falls into that idea of its absolutely golden period Rush, of doing that straight progressive metal sort of thing. And that's one of the reasons for that. And then you also get a different phenomenon going on, where something like Hold Your Fire is being touted by a much younger generation of Rush fan. And again, we're into the songwriting thing. Oh, they're great songwriters at this point, which you can't defend against or argue against. And then you even get people who start saying, what was crappy and out of vogue before, all these drum sounds and keyboard sounds, are actually kind of cool again, because they're so out, they're in again, kind of thing. So you get that going on. And I want to mention one other thing. So the idea of, so you think of counterparts, and here you get almost it's a narrative that we all enforce when we have to talk about an album in a short space of time, or the band themselves talk about an album in the short space of time. I've done a pile of stuff on Rush and worked on that Rush movie and stuff. And you see a lot of interviews with these guys. And it's a funny phenomenon where when an album first comes out, they'll talk about it for 20 minutes. And then when the album's 10 years old, you're down to the 2 or 3 minute version of what they think of the album. And then they're forgetting everything. Plus they're getting bored with it and don't want to talk about it anymore. And all of a sudden, 30 years down the line, you ask Alex Lifeson about counterparts, and it's like, that's when we got heavy again. Or that's when, or that's when the guitar came back, or you talk about Presto and Roll the Bones. Those are the singing albums. Those are the songwriting albums, right? Or those are basically everybody in the band and all us yappers about these things. We're so bored with it. We just want to give you the three-word answer on the album. So the narratives get shorter and shorter and shorter. And that's what happens with some of these as well. So this one's got the narrative that it's Rush got heavy again. And it's really not that heavy. It's not a big difference. It's got some bottom end and stuff, and it's got Animate and Stick It Out. That's the other thing. You put out the advanced single and it's heavy, and the advanced single gets a lot of light put on it, right?
Oh yeah,
because everybody's talking about the advanced single for a while, and that's what happened with Stick It Out. So yeah, Rush I think is one of those like that. And the other reason Rush is like this is because they are like Maiden and Kiss, absolutely, dissected to the core, discussed for hours and hours and hours. And when that happens, when that happens, you get a lot of people talking about these things, but you also start getting to see those younger fans come out of the woodwork, and they aren't gonna feel that same connection to albums that they couldn't have bought as new releases. Just like all of us, they have the connection to the albums they bought as new releases, and some of them did buy Hold Your Fire as a new release. So that's
Well, yeah, I mean that's a great point, because I think Counterparts especially is Rush's Painkiller. Because for the longtime fans that like the old heavy, really proggy stuff, Counterparts was a return to them playing more aggressive music, right? So after albums like Presto and Roll the Bones and Hold Your Fire and Power Windows, so we're going to naturally look at that album a little bit differently. But someone who jumped on board with Hold Your Fire or Presto or Roll the Bones, Counterparts is really no different, right? It's no better or worse than anything that came before, because they jumped on board with Rush as they were at that time. So it all depends on when you came into the catalog, and how old you might be and what you were listening to before. So yeah, that's a great choice. That's a great choice. All right, let's move on to Deep Purple. So classic albums, right? Fireball, In Rock, Machine Head, Made in Japan, all that stuff, right? Was anybody talking about Who Do We Think We Are back in the day? Not much. Sales show that people just, kind of were like, all right, yeah, this maybe is a lackluster album. The band obviously were, Blackmore and Gillan were not getting along. And it's got some classic tracks on here. You got Woman from Tokyo on here. I think this is one of their better deep cut albums, but this didn't set the world on fire back in the day. The lineup kind of splintered up. They went from Mark II to Mark III. I think over, the next ensuing 10, 20 years, this was kind of like the forgotten album from that classic lineup of the band. But in more recent years, I think because people are maybe bored with hearing Smoke on the Water and Highway Star and Space Truckin' and all those kind of tracks, you come to an album like this, and all of a sudden you got Mary Long and Super Trooper and Smooth Dancer and Rat Bat Blue and things like that. All of a sudden it's like, wow, those are pretty rockin', pretty good Deep Purple songs. It's almost like it's like a new Deep Purple album for those who really didn't get into it back in the day. So I can kind of see where this would rise up on the ranking because of that reason. You're just tired of hearing those other classics over and over and over again. And then this is a perfect example. This is, this lineup didn't have a lot of albums, right? So that kind of makes sense. What's really interesting, though, is an album like Come Taste the Band, which this was, again, no first album without Blackmore, really different. So the Mark III album, Blackmore leaves, goes on to Rainbow. They bring in Tommy Bolin, kind of a strange fit. So they take the kind of the funkiness of Stormbringer to another level here. And this album, the tour, didn't do well. You had, the drug addictions of both Hughes and Bolin. Bolin died not that long after the band broke up. This was kind of forgotten for many, many years. I'm a perfect example of someone who just kind of like ignored this, forgot about it. And then in more recent years, because again, I'm a huge Purple fan, I've listened to all their albums to death over the years. And I don't know what it was, maybe about 20 years ago, Martin, I decided to give this kind of like another chance. And I was like, wow, it's really, really good album. Why is it good? Because it's fresh now? Because I didn't listen to it a lot back in the day? Or is it just a really, really good album? It may not be a great Deep Purple album, but it's a really good rock album, like a bluesy, funky rock album. And as time goes on, the legend of Tommy Bolin has grown, right? That has a lot to do with it, I think. And this album has steadily risen up the rankings in the Deep Purple catalog, probably more so than this one, even though this has what everybody looks at as the classic lineup. And I think that 20, 30 years from now, we might see this go even up a little bit higher. So for an album that nobody really talked about way back when, a lot of people talk about this now. And I still come across people who are not that into this band because they can't accept Deep Purple without Ritchie Blackmore. We have the same issue we hear from people who, the Steve Morse era, they won't even bother listening to it because Blackmore's not there. It's just a tribute band now, Lord's gone, all this kind of stuff. Whatever, I get it. But I personally think that this one deserves its place now for a reason, and I'm guilty for ignoring it for a while. But I think there's lots of reasons why it's looked at this way now. I think it's pretty classy stuff. Again, maybe not a classic Deep Purple album, but if you call this, I think we talked about this once before, you call this, give a new name, a new band name to this, whatever you want to call it, and you look at it with fresh eyes and ears as not Deep Purple, but as some other band, I think it's a classic.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. So basically yesterday I had posted up on Goldmine one of my top 20 lists. So we put, published the top 20 Deep Purple songs from the 70s, right? And I put at number 20 Mary Long, and I knew Monty would come right out of the woodwork first. He'd be the first guy to comment on this because we've argued about Mary Long before, right? I think it's a good solid Deep Purple song. It's got this story about it's against censorship on TV shows and stuff like that. Mary Long is a put together name of a couple different people, blah blah blah. I think the riff is pretty good on it. I think the interplay. So I put it at number 20, and number 20 kind of looks like a number 1 in a certain, because we went in reverse order, right? But it's the first thing he sees, and I knew when I was typing that, oh, I know Monty's gonna get on me, and he's in there. So we all started arguing about this album, and then people came out and said, where's Our Lady? Where's Place in Line? Oh, these are great songs, these are, so it turned into a big debate about that album. And so I really do agree. Like you named all these songs that were just as solid as many of the songs on the other Mark II albums. Like, certainly, I think this album, I've always thought this album sounded like and stood up to Fireball. More than anything, those two kind of go together for me. But I think the big point here is that there just weren't that many original Mark II Deep Purple albums. So again, you get sick of all the other ones, and this is just sitting there ripe for deep analysis, right? Yeah. And so it gets that major look in, right?
Yeah, I mean it's an album that for many of us just kind of got ignored in the catalog. Maybe we never disliked it, but we paid more attention to the other ones. And now when you reach a point where you don't need to listen to those other ones anymore, you can put on Who Do We Think We Are and be like, wow, I haven't listened to Mary Long a million times in my life. I've maybe only listened to it 50 times in my life. So you know what? This is really good because it's kind of fresh now, 50 years later, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So my next choice is kind of a weird one. Very short catalog. UK. So the idea with UK is kind of interesting here. I almost feel like the idea of being this kind of put together super group at sort of a weird time for prog. Prog's a little unfashionable. It is the punk time. There are all these bands, members are getting changed all over the place. There's solo albums everywhere. UK kind of came and went at the time. It wasn't considered that big of a deal, right? And it was considered kind of like just matching people together, and they're a band, and these guys obviously didn't go to high school together and all that kind of stuff, right? And then you get the lineup change for the second one, and then they make a live album with a crappy album cover, and then they're gone, right? So it's it just felt like this sort of like, oh, here's a new prog album coming out with a bunch of guys sort of thing. Over time, we look back on it and go, this is a really great prog album. It's a straight prog album, so it pushes all those buttons you want a prog album to push. But at the time, you didn't want a straight prog album. The world was tired of getting someone like deliberately making such a straight prog album, right? With long songs and parts and all that sort of stuff. So over time, it just kind of grows and grows and grows in stature. And we look back and we say, boy, that was just a magical, short-lived band that was there. And you get the massive reissue of it, the big box set thing and stuff. So that's just one of those that I guess aligns with that other thing I said earlier about prog albums tending to be those really expensive albums where prog just as an idea has stood up as something collectible. And so UK certainly isn't in that camp with these records because they made a lot of them. They're on a major label and all that stuff. But yeah, I just feel like now people look back on that as a legendary band, and at the time it was like, whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. Look what when that first album came out, that was a bunch of years after the heyday of prog, right? So you're talking like the punk days, and so prog is already deemed as dinosaur music, and here comes UK, this supergroup.
And mine's a cutout. My second one is a cutout. I'm sure there were a lot of cutouts.
Oh yeah, yeah. So those albums did not sell well at all back in the day. Like I said, I think they came a couple of years too late to the game. But I think that because all these years later, the legend of UK continues to grow because of the people in the band. I mean, every musician who set foot in that band was deemed a legend in the genre. And I think the short career also has a lot of appeal. I mean, if you look back on some of those like kind of really, really cool bands that kind of flamed out really, really quickly, I think history is very kind to them. So yeah, the legend of UK continues to grow. And I think a lot of people who are like real big fans now and talk so highly about those albums, deep down inside, they kind of wish that band was together maybe in 1973, where they could have been the big impactful band that they probably should have been. But late 70s, yeah, not really happening, unfortunately.
Maybe people are even tired of bands named after places too, right? That started to be a trend, right?
Yeah, it could be. I don't know. But good albums, and I think too, the big debate about UK is like from UK fans, it's like, well, just trying to get into discussions about which of the two albums is better, right? Do you like the album with guitar and Holdsworth, or do you like it without? Do you like it with Bruford, or do you like it with Bozio, right? So there's that debate that continues all the time about which of the two albums is better. Never mind that they're both really, really great, right? But everybody's always got to make a choice, one or the other.
And it makes for a short internet show where you don't have to do a lot of homework, right? The shorter a catalog, you can work out a show and just talk about the whole band, right?
Yeah. I did a ranking the album show of UK, 2 albums, right? And then all the people like, no, Danger Money is the better one. I like the first album better, right? So yeah, it's like whatever. I mean, it's amazing. A band with such a short career and only 2 albums, you could sit and have debates about UK for hours. Hours. Crazy. All right. Let's see. Let's move on to Black Sabbath. So this will be fun. So our all of you long time, and I'm talking long time, Black Sabbath fans, are any of you bored with Paranoid in the first album, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Master of Reality, Volume 4? And is that the reason why in more recent years, and again, this is my perception, that an album like Technical Ecstasy is being deemed as good as those albums I just mentioned? I'll throw Sabotage in there as well, because there are those classic first handful of albums. To me, there was a big drop off between Sabotage and this. But I know a lot of people, Martin as well, who rate this still really high. And it's not a bad album. I'm not saying it is. To me, this is a step down from what came before. I remember back in the day, like it was yesterday, when most Sabbath fans hated this album. People now say it's the best album they ever did, or one of the best albums they ever did. Gee, I wonder who some of those people are. And again, that's cool if you think so, right? But are we saying that now over the last 20, 30 years, or even the last decade, because we're just tired of hearing Paranoid? Or is this really all that good? I don't know. That's the question we have for all of you. This next album, I loved from day one, but I know a lot of people who didn't buy it, hated the album cover, hated the fact that Ian Gillan joined Black Sabbath, hated the fact that Ronnie James Dio was no longer in Black Sabbath. So Born Again was kind of like, became dead again, right? Sabbath is now, started the decline of Black Sabbath throughout the 80s. But in recent years, I saw it just yesterday, the day before, where people are saying, this is my favorite Black Sabbath album of all time. Is it the mystique of this album because they only did the one album and it's such a weird story, the recording of the album, the production of the album cover, the fact that it's Sabbath meets Purple, the one tour, the crazy tour, the Stonehenge thing, the dwarves? I don't know. Is this all of a sudden just such a legendary album for all the wrong reasons? Or is this still kind of hated by by a lot of the fan base? Don't know. And more importantly, are we that bored with this and everything else I've just talked about that we're now going to the Tony Martin era, which Martin, as you well know, was completely ignored by everybody in the entire universe. Now, all of a sudden, Eternal Idol, this is great. Headless Cross, Tear, these are great Black Sabbath albums. Why nobody talks about them? Well, nobody talks about them, nobody bought them, but now all of a sudden, that's the era of Black Sabbath that seems to get the most attention now. Again, many of us were listening to these back in the day and couldn't understand why nobody gave a shit, why nobody went. Black Sabbath were playing in clubs, right? Nobody cared. All right, they hired an unknown singer. Okay, but are any of the, I'm not going to say that any of these albums are on par with Mob Rules or Heaven and Hell or even Dehumanizer, right, with Dio, but these are really solid Black Sabbath albums. To me, they always were, but many people didn't think so back in the day. So now, all these years later, are people discovering these for the first time and realizing what they missed back in the day? Or do we have lots of younger people who are just discovering Black Sabbath now, more recently, and saying, hey, these are no different than the Dio albums or the Ozzy album. These are all really, really great. And all of a sudden now, the Tony Martin era is almost on par with everything else. I don't know. I'm sure you have something to add to all that.
Yeah, out of the Tony Martin ones, I keep hearing Tear mentioned a lot, right? Because it's got that Norse thing going, and interestingly enough, the next Jethro Tull album has a bunch of that going on with
Yeah.
it, right? But so yeah, I hear that with Tear. Born Again, it's like everybody loves talking about it. It's so fun talking about the production on it and that. And then you also think possibly we've been like inoculated a little bit by the rise of death metal and black metal to that sound, and we think, oh well, it's pretty tame compared to that stuff. Yeah. And then Mob Rules, I remember, is seems to have gone up a tiny bit over time. It's at the time it was a little bit of the band's afterburner, right? After Eliminator kind of thing. So it was like, it's kind of the same again, but it ain't no Heaven and Hell sort of thing. But now with that one, it's like the legend of Ronnie James Dio and the death of Ronnie James Dio as well feeds into that. And then finally going back to the early days, it's like we're back to that original premise. There ain't enough original Black Sabbath to go around. You eventually wind up talking about, the last two because there's only 8 of them anyways, right?
Yeah, I agree with you on Mob Rules. I talk to more people these days who now favor Mob Rules over Heaven and Hell. Not that you need to pick one over the other, but I think they're produced very differently. Like, we often talk about Martin Birch and his production style and how, does he really have a distinct style? And just like with Blue Oyster Cult, he did the 2 albums with Blue Oyster Cult. They sound very different from each other. I mean, Mob Rules and Heaven and Hell are completely different from a sonic perspective. And I think over years, people have really gravitated towards Mob Rules because I think it might have the stronger deep cuts. I think Heaven and Hell has the stronger like classic tracks, but I think Mob Rules, the stock has really, really risen in years. Where I talk to a lot of people who now pick Mob Rules as their favorite Ronnie James Dio album with the band. I couldn't really argue it much. I still tend to go with Heaven and Hell usually, but I can see the Mob Rules opinion as well.
Yeah. All right. So my last choice is Aerosmith. And the odd thing here is that it's 3 albums chronologically in a row that I feel strongly fit this category the most. So you start with Night in the Ruts, Rock in a Hard Place, and Done with Mirrors, right? So again, who knows how you hold that one up mirror wise, right? So again, we're at a point where the anything before Night in the Ruts has been discussed to death, so there's that going on. But definitely, I remember at the time, Night in the Ruts was not well received. It was a big drop off. The band was in the middle of breaking up. You get Rock in a Hard Place. It was even less well received. Everybody kind of got the story that Steven Tyler was at his absolute nadir. He was at his worst with the drugs. Both guitarists are swapped out for 2 other guitarists. And then you've got Done with Mirrors, which people admired the basicness and the rawness of it, but they didn't think the songs were really their sort of thing. But it was also not it took the next album for them to start that big rise. So these 3 albums in a row were all denigrated at the time, But now I know lots of people. I've always been, you know, quite high on Night on the Ruts. I think it's my second favorite Aerosmith album. But I get a lot of people, and we did a panel on Night in the Ruts where everybody was singing its praises. But yeah, I know a lot of smart music fans who love that album and put it super high, and a lot of smart music fans who like Rock in a Hard Place a lot, and then a lot that are you know, I think Done with Mirrors is the one that's starting to see a little bit, and so again, you get a little bit of that we talked about kind of with the King Crimson thing, where everything after that, there's a lot to complain about. And soon as you've got 7 studio albums in a row or whatever it is, that a lot of people have a lot to complain about. You know, I mean, you know, a lot of people like Pump quite a bit and Permanent Vacation somewhat, but Pump is the one that's considered pretty good out of all those. But a whole bunch of records in a row, that makes you turn and say, oh man, those other ones weren't that bad. If we're going to talk about Aerosmith, we need something to talk about, and it's these 3 albums.
Yeah, and you know, yeah, I agree 100%, and it kind of also begs the question, and we can ask ourselves here, we can ask everybody who's watching. You may love Toys in the Attic and Rocks, but how many people are bored with those albums?
Yeah,
I rarely listen to them anymore, but you know what? I go to Night in the Ruts quite often. I go to Rock in a Hard Place quite often.
Yeah,
and why not? Right, when you kind of heard all you can hear from those classic albums, it's like you go to the next ones and say, okay, you know, draw the line too. Yeah, quite strong. So,
and the interesting thing is, you know, you might put those records down and say, oh, it's just Aerosmith doing the same thing again. It's very much like Who Do We Think We Are? They're doing the same thing again. They're just giving us more Aerosmith. Arguably, it's not as good songs as the other ones. And then the next album, they're doing the same thing again. But you know, 30, 40 years later, when you only got 5 or 6 albums of Aerosmith doing that great thing Aerosmith does, it's like you treasure the fact that they were doing the same thing again.
Oh, of course, because God forbid they do something different, then it's no good, right? Yeah, for sure. All right, so my last choice today is not so much a single band, but kind of a group of bands, and there's way more to fit in here than just a couple that I picked out here. But this whole concept of these more obscure bands who maybe were not signed to major labels, or maybe they were back when they first burst on the scene. Albums didn't sell. They broke up quickly thereafter. Record labels dropped them. They kind of have fallen into the abyss of rock and roll history. But over time, people start singing their praises. Again, maybe we're bored with the big bands, and now we look at these bands that we say they should have been huge, right? These are legendary underground albums that it's just, you cannot believe why people didn't gravitate towards them. And here the kind of the theme is like these proto metal bands, right? So these bands that came on the scene early 70s, but never reached the heights of a Zeppelin or a Sabbath or a Purple or a Uriah Heep or even Budgie or whatever, anything like that. So from Australia, Buffalo, right? This volcanic rock album. People talk about it like it's one of the greatest undiscovered early heavy metal albums of all time, right? It's quite good. A band like Bang, right, who had the self-titled album and Mother Bow to the King, right? Bang was this U.S. band. They were going to be the next Black Sabbath. If you ever listen to them, it's kind of like Black Sabbath meets the Beatles meets Grand Funk Railroad. Again, Bang is now all of a sudden one of those unsung, signed to a major label band that never quite made it. Sir Lord Baltimore from New York, right? You had their debut album. It's actually quite heavy for the time. I mean, we're talking here, they were together just 69, 70, 71. Then they disappeared for a million years, came back and did another album. Proto metal for sure. Big, heavy riffs, slashing guitar, fast and frenzied songs. There's a little bit of a punk element to their music as well. Again, people now talk about that debut album as like one of the unsung classics of heavy music. Most people kind of like Sir Lord Baltimore. Who the hell is that, right? Leaf Hound, British band, Growers of Mushroom. Looked at now as one of the first ever stoner rock albums, right? One of the greatest albums of the early 70s, maybe. Captain Beyond, All right. Rod Evans from Deep Purple and a bunch of other guys from various bands, right? Kind of like a super group. This album kind of sank without a trace, but now all of a sudden, this is legendary. Like one of the first ever mixes of like progressive rock and stoner rock and proto metal. It's complicated. It's the songwriting is really intricate. The arrangements are intricate. This is a very, very cool album. But now, but nobody cared back in the day. Now, though, this is one of the legendary unsung bands. And then also from New York, Dust. People talk about, the album, great album cover, right? Album covers, and one of the great proto metal bands. These albums are so heavy. Man, you listen to them today, Martin. We talked about this before. I don't think these albums are all that heavy. These Dust albums, there are heavy moments on them, and maybe because, certain Mr. Ramon played in this band, right? That gets a little bit more notoriety than maybe it ever deserved, but these solid records. But again, now these are being looked at as legendary albums. And a lot of times when you talk about stuff like this and you throw those terms like legend out there, and then people will ask, well, if they're so legendary, why did nobody buy them back in the day? Why are people talking about them now? So over time, have we got bored with the big heavy bands, and now our thirst for more has led us to these bands who got ignored back when they first appeared, and now we're like saying, these are really good. These should have been classic albums. Let's make them classic albums now.
Yeah, exactly. So it goes back. You put it perfectly. The thirst for more. So it goes back to there wasn't enough heavy stuff back then. So everything heavy, is as long as it's fairly heavy, it's got that little bit of pixie dust on it, where people will take that in. Give them an inch, they'll take a mile. All of a sudden, it becomes more classic and more classic and more classic. And I always say, I like sometimes, and people like talking about those albums because it makes them look smart, kind of thing. It's like, oh, I know the deep stuff, right? But there's also that end of it where you put on your A&R hat and say, Black Sabbath was famous for a reason. Deep Purple was successful for a reason, right? Though it might be boring to say Black Sabbath is better than every one of those bands, but I think it's accurate, right? Everything about those bands is, I find a lot of that stuff dated and not that well written. I loved your Beatles Grand Funk mixed with Black Sabbath thing. It's like, what a mess, right? And it comes out dated, right? So yeah, that's the funny thing about that whole bunch. And again, it comes back to those Facebook and YouTube comments where people just want to write something short that makes them look smart, right? And so you just mentioned Sir Lord Baltimore, and it's like you're now in the club, right? Sort of thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's like, I'm cool because I like this stuff that nobody else knows about, right?
Yeah.
But on the same token, I always think it's really cool when you are someone who mentions a obscure band like this, and then five people all of a sudden, I never heard of them before. I'm going to go check them out. Wow, this is really good. I really like this. Why did I never listen to this back in the day? So again, are we only exposing ourselves to bands because the record label and the media and the radio stations are telling us that this is what you should listen to? So perceptions of albums, I think, can change over time based on your exposure to them.
Yeah. But it's funny. It's like you go down the whole, these guys should have been huge thing, right? And I think in the 70s, there aren't that many of those bands out there. But as you move on in time, when it becomes much easier to make records and there's way more albums coming out all the time, all of a sudden in the 2000s, there are hundreds and hundreds of bands that you say they're as good as the superstars. But in the old days, in the 70s, I feel like that argument is lesser. When I hear all these bands that didn't make it, because they're all recording with the big producers, they're all on major labels, because there were no small labels,
Right.
particularly, right? There were imprints of the majors, distributed by the majors, all that blah blah blah. But they're all made in expensive studios, so there's this level playing field. But I think there's very few of those bands from the 70s where I can honestly say this band should have been huge. Yet now it's like there's so much art out there that it's all about as good as each other. And then there's the other 12 ducks in a row that have to line up to actually make it huge.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about like a band like Blood Rock, right? Who, again, one of these kind of like lower tier bands that put out a bunch of albums in the 70s and had like a hint of success and opened up for all the big bands, right? But never achieved that kind of status, right? They never did like headlining tours. They never had a gold album or anything above that. Never, other than like DOA, no real hit singles or anything like that. So, were they kind of where they were based on that was as high as they were ever going to go? That was their ceiling, right? And a lot of these like bands that I just talked about here is they're moderate, very, very moderate to no success. Is that just as high as they were ever going to go? Or, do you count in factors like, maybe the record label dropped them because the debut album didn't sell, right? And maybe record labels didn't have a lot of tolerance for that back in the day, or maybe they didn't get on all the big tours, or we talk about like Max Webster, right? Max Webster is one of those crazy bands that like people who really love Max Webster are always kind of like, God, yeah, I really would have loved to have seen them be a bigger band. They were touring with Rush all the time. Music is great, but I mean, if you talk honestly, right? Were Max Webster at the level of success that they probably were ever going to be?
Exactly. They're one of my favorite bands of all time, but people say, oh, they should have been bigger. And I almost feel like saying, have you seen a picture of Max Webster? Right.
I got into this conversation with someone online about Budgie a couple of months ago, and they were like, oh, the vocals aren't especially good. The songs are too long or they're too short. You got heavy songs and really mellow songs. The song titles are a million miles long. Budgie were never going to be huge. And I'm like, yeah, maybe not, but there's so much great stuff in the Budgie catalog, and for a band that really didn't have a hell of a lot of success. So you could talk about this stuff hours and hours and hours just going over.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Max Webster thing is a great example. It's like, we love Max Webster, but they were never going to be a huge band, right? With that kind of music they're playing the way
have you read their lyrics? Have you read Pie's lyrics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so there you have it, everybody. So the moral of this story here is we want to hear from you guys. So I would expect lots and lots of comments here. And if you are someone who falls into the category of thinking that a lot of these albums we talked about today are great albums and are classics, why do you think that? Like, because basically the argument we're kind of trying to bring forth here is that when these albums first came out, they were not thought of as classics, and even like in the ensuing years shortly thereafter. But now all these years later, a lot of people are saying they are. So we want to hear from you guys as to why you think so. Help educate us a little bit. We're trying to come up with arguments about why they probably are, but we want to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So get busy down below in the comments. We want to hear from you on this one. And Martin, while everybody's doing that, why don't you give us updates on books in stock, books coming, Contrarians episodes, podcasts, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff is the audio podcast. And that's the last one was all about making bass interesting. So it's all about bass stuff. And then we had good drum sounds and bad drum sounds. Contrarians, we got stuff coming all the time. And the books are all at martinpopoff.com. The recent one that I'm packing up and signing and sending out a lot is the AC/DC at 50.
Okay. Now you're out of stock on that now? Is that all?
No, got it back. Got it back in. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Pink Floyd out of stock till May. That completely ran out, but I did manage to get 30 more AC/DC.
Okay, so if you haven't gotten your AC/DC book yet, head on over to martinpopoff.com and scoop up Martin's last 30 copies. I'm sure he would love to unload those as quickly as possible. So got to make room for the other stuff, right? I don't know how you fit all these books, Martin. It's like those things are big, man. Those are big suckers. 30 of those. Woo, that's a pallet right there, Holy cow. So let's see, what do we got coming up here on the channel? So stay tuned for ranking the albums on Saturday. I will be ranking the top 10 Bruce Springsteen albums. I've been talking about doing that for a million years, so finally getting around to that. And then we've got coming up on Tuesday, we've got the In the Prog Seat, where we're going to be doing another album study on Coliseum 2's War Dance album. So that's coming up on Tuesday. And then new album reviews on Wednesday. And then, you'll blink, Martin, and we'll be back here at the Funhouse a week from today. So stay tuned, everybody. Visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube all together all the damn time. Please subscribe if you haven't already and click on that notification bell so you get alert of all of our content as it posts. And please do click that like button. Also, that's very, very important. That will help us out here with the YouTube algorithm. So till next week, for Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Have a good weekend, everybody. We'll see you back here at the Funhouse. Take care. Bye-bye.